Okay, so once again we had the question, how can so many smart philosophers and so many smart scientists involve themselves with the Marxist or communist philosophy? How is that possible? Well, you figure out these philosophies had an ideal to offer, yes? They promised a better world, but they promised to do it through an ideal. So, for example, the word Heilstaat, it pretty much means the salvation state or whatever, or like the realm of freedom or whatever. Like, there was some sort of country in which every man was free. He was free to fish in the morning, to farm in the evening, and to hunt whenever he wanted, and to read poetry and write literature. And he would be perfectly free, and he would be free from industrial labor, he would be free from dictatorial governments, and he would be free from suppression by the police. And he would be totally free to walk in a field of green grass and smell the meadows on the early morning, while working in his own cottage somewhere in a peaceful landscape. Pretty much, that was the whole idea, that there could be some sort of ideal in the future where everyone was free and where everyone was equal and where everyone was united by the ideal to all live happily, peacefully, ever after. So, this ideal, this utopia, was dangerous. That's what Karl Popper thought. That this ideal was very dangerous because this idea is so far into the future. So, we are in the here and now, in the present, and this idea is so far into the future. So, how can we get from A, here, to B, there, in that utopia? That's a very long road. And the thing is that you cannot always see the consequences of your actions. So, the road towards the utopia is bound to change. There's bound to come a lot of revolts. There's bound to come a lot of problems. So you might lose track of the road. And then, once you have to take new measures, how do you know if these measures, in fact, contribute to that goal? So, you might have to make sacrifices to reach the utopia, but since the world is very complicated, you might be in fact taking measures that work against the utopia. So you might in fact be doing regulations or enforcing laws or enforcing measures and procedures that destroy the other measures. You might be working against your own goal. You might be working against yourself. And it's possible that you don't even see this because this utopia is so far away in the distant future. Yes? So he warned against this utopia idea. It was very dangerous. And it misguided people. And this idea brought people to do inhumane measures. Yes? Here. I'll read a part of the book of Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies. It's the Dutch version, is page 196. He says, the idea of the aestheticist, so he said, an aesthetical idea, this idea of a utopia is to a great extent an aesthetical idea, an idea of beauty. He says, this is a genuine description of the compromiseless attitude of all forms of radicalism, of the refusal of the aesthetic, the refusal of the artist to make compromises. He holds the position that society has to have the beauty of a piece of art, and this position leads all too easily to violence. But the radicalism and violence is irrealistic and is useless. And this is shown by the recent example in Russia, he writes. After the economic problems that the cleaning of the work of art due to the so-called war communism had led to, Lenin introduced his new economical policy. In fact, this new economical policy was nothing else than some sort of step-by-step social engineering, but then without formulating the basis idea of it. First, Lenin restored the work of art so that the parts which he had removed the money, he had removed the private property, but these parts became visible again once Lenin had done his new economical policy. Money, markets, difference in income, private property, temporarily, even particularly enterprises, came back, and even after this basis was restored, he started a new time of reforms. That's what he writes. So he pretty much, Popper writes pretty much, he writes this. He says, Okay, Lenin, he wanted to have a class-free society where everyone is a laborer, where everyone is free to have his own cottage, and where it's a utopia of equality. So to reach this, we must first abandon private property. But abandoning private property led to a bunch of problems. So what Lenin did, he reintroduced those private properties, and there you had it. That's what Karl Popper said. So he had an ideal, he had a utopia, he wanted to go towards it, and he stumbled upon problems while going towards his distant utopia, and he had in fact to do measures that were different from his original idea. So he said, see, this utopian social engineering idea is impossible because it leads to problems, and we have to solve those problems in the here and now. And this is some sort of evidence that Popper uses to prove that we cannot think too far into the future when it comes to creating an ideal or creating an utopia. And he said that this kind of idea also leads to drastic, inhumane, totalitarian measures. I'll give you some example. For example, when Stalin gained the power in Russia, he had some sort of measures. He had measures saying, okay, from now on everyone has to give his animals, every farmer has to give his animals to a collective farm. Sovkhozen or kolkhozen were these called. And these were collective farms where people worked together to farm for Mother Russia, or the farm for the ideal, or the farm for the classless society, pretty much. But the reality was that people were not willing to give up their animals. They were not willing to give up their vegetables. And they were not willing to give up their private property. So, the Russian army was forced to come into Ukraine, and the Russian soldiers forced the farmers in Ukraine to give up their animals and to give up their vegetables. But they refused to do this, because even though these farmers were poor, they were incredibly poor. They were peasants. But they said, even though this is only a worthless small cabin, and only though they are some meager animals, they still are animals, and it's still my farm, so I don't want to give this to the Russian soldiers. And what they did was this: they killed their own animals and they burned their own vegetables, simply because they did not want to give it to the Russians, and they didn't want to give it to the collective communist state. So this led to poverty and hunger, and as a result, the Russian army was forced to send even more soldiers down to force people to work and to force people to hand over their stuff to the government. And this led to increasing subordination of the population, and it led to suppression of the population, because the Russians had to force people to give their possessions to the state. So, another example would be Mao. Mao would be another good example. For example, in China, he had policies like the Great Leap Forward, or he had policies like the Cultural Revolution. And what happened there was that he said, okay, China has to become an industrial nation, a first-class world industrial nation. And in order to do this, we have to build industrial factories, and we have to build tools. We need gears. We need metal. Therefore, the peasants were forced to melt metal on their own fields. So instead of farming and having grain, they needed to melt metal and make tools. But the problem was that most of these peasants had no experience in making tools, and they had no experience in melting metal or working metal. They had no experience in that. And this led to many accidents, and many people died because they have no idea how to operate such a forge, basically. They had no idea how to operate it, so they died because of accidents. And this was a big problem. So Mao had this idea in his head, like, okay, I need an industrial state. I'm just going to force the industrial. I don't have industry. I don't have it. I don't have industrial laborers, but I have peasants. So I'm going to force the peasants to do this. I'm going to make the peasants build the factories for me. That's pretty much his idea. So he was very high up, and he decided how very low down people had to do it. But this was a big problem because they had no experience in how to melt metal, and it led to problems. So he had this map, and this is what Popper calls the aestheticist approach. And Popper said there's philosophers with an aesthetic idea, like Plato. Plato also has an aesthetic idea. Marx has it. They all have it. They see the country as some sort of map that they can draw upon anything they like, some sort of as a drawing that they can fill in, that they can create a beautiful piece of art. But it's not. You're dealing with a gruesome, complicated reality. That's what Popper said. So Mao drawed in his mind, he had a map of China in which he drew an industrial nation, and he just simply had to force the peasants to carry it out. But it didn't work that way, because this led to conflicts that you could not see, because you're working towards an idea that is so far ahead in the future, you are so far removed from it, that it's impossible, and that it leads to problems. That's what Popper's idea is.